The blizzard had been building since early afternoon, and by the time Wyatt Brennan finally made the decision to ride out, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. His foreman, Dale Pruitt, had stood in the doorway of the stable with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular way he had when he thought his employer was making a mistake but knew better than to say so directly. Dale had worked for Wyatt for 11 years. He'd learned the architecture of the man's stubbornness. "Storm's getting worse," Dale said. "I know. Road through Harmon's Pass is going to be near impassable by dark." "I know that too." "She might not even be on the coach," Dale said. "Might have gotten held up back in Billings. Coaches miss connections all the time in weather like this." Wyatt was already cinching the saddle on his gray stallion, Buck, and he didn't look up. "She left Billings 4 days ago. The connection would have come through Rawlings Station by now. She should be on the afternoon run." "Should be," Dale said, and left it at that. The thing was, Wyatt couldn't explain it, not in any way that would have made sense to a practical man like Dale. The woman on that coach, Clara Whitmore, was a stranger to him by any reasonable definition of the word. They had exchanged letters for the better part of 7 months. He knew her handwriting, which was precise and a little cramped on the left side, like someone who'd been corrected for using the wrong hand as a child. He knew she was 31 years old and had spent most of her adult life in Pennsylvania working as a seamstress after her mother passed. He knew she had a dry sense of humor that appeared in her letters without warning, usually in the middle of something serious, like a crack of light under a closed door. He did not know her face. He did not know the sound of her voice. He did not know if she was frightened or steady or somewhere in between. But she was coming to Montana to marry him, and she was coming alone, and there was a blizzard on the road. So he rode. The snow hit in earnest about 3 miles out from the ranch, the wind picking up until it was driving sideways across the flats and making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. Buck moved steadily beneath him, the horse better in this terrain than any animal Wyatt had ever owned. Sure-footed in a way that felt almost deliberate, like the horse understood the stakes. Wyatt had been riding Montana winters for 23 years. Since he came out from Ohio as a young man with money his father had left him, and a stubbornness that his mother had always said would either build something great or get him killed. He'd built something. The Brennan Ranch stretched across 1,400 acres of the Gallatin Valley, cattle country that he'd grown from 300 head to over 1,000 through years of careful management, drought strategy, and the kind of slow, accumulating patience that most men his age didn't have. He'd also lost his wife 4 years ago. That part of his life he'd boxed up and set on a shelf somewhere in the back of his chest and learned not to look at too often. Emily had been 5 when her mother Rose died of fever. She was 9 now, and she had Rose's dark eyes and Wyatt's silence, and she moved through the world with a careful watchfulness that broke his heart a little every time he saw it. She needed more than he could give her alone. He knew that. He'd known it for 2 years before he finally let Dale's wife, Nora, talk him into writing to the agency in St. Louis. He hadn't expected to feel anything reading those letters. He'd expected the transaction of it. A practical woman, a practical arrangement, a home for her and a mother for Emily. That was what he'd told himself he was doing. And then Clara Whitmore had written back, and her first letter had started with, "Mr. Brennan, I should tell you at the outset that I am not a romantic, which may either reassure you or put you off entirely depending on the kind of man you are. I suspect you'll tell me soon enough." He'd read that sentence 3 times. The coach was not where it was supposed to be. Harmon's Pass was a narrow cut through the ridge that connected the main road to the eastern route into Garrison, and the afternoon coach from Rawlings should have come through it by 3 o'clock. Wyatt reached the mouth of the pass at 3:30 and found nothing. No tracks that hadn't been buried by the storm, no sound of wheels or horses, nothing moving in any direction except the snow. He sat on Buck for a long moment, thinking. Then he heard it. It wasn't loud, just a sharp edge of sound cutting through the wind, high and brief, and gone before he could be certain he'd heard it at all. But Buck's ears had already swiveled, and the horse shifted his weight toward the south side of the pass where the road dipped toward a frozen creek bed. Wyatt let Buck move. They found the wagon 40 yards off the road, its front axle snapped clean through, and one wheel lying separately in the snow like something discarded. It wasn't a passenger coach. It was a smaller conveyance, a private hire, the kind that connected to the larger lines for the last leg of rural routes. The horse that had been pulling it was gone. either fled or cut loose, and there was no driver anywhere in sight. For a moment, Wyatt thought the wagon was empty. Then he saw the hand. She was on the far side of the wagon, wedged into the space between the collapsed side and a drift of snow that had begun to build up against the frame. She'd gotten herself there. That much was clear. She wasn't unconscious from the fall. She'd moved, deliberately, to get out of the wind. That told him something. She looked up when he crouched beside her, and her eyes were dark and very alert, which was the most important thing, because the cold hadn't taken her yet. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "My ankle," she said. Her voice was steadier than he'd expected. "I think it's sprained, not broken. I can move it, and I'm cold. I can see that." He looked at her face, pale, wind-burned at the cheeks, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. She was managing herself carefully, keeping herself calm. "Can you stand?" "I don't know. I haven't tried." "Try." She pressed one hand against the wagon frame and pushed herself up, and he watched her jaw tighten when her right ankle took weight. But she didn't make a sound. She stood. "Good," he said. Then he saw her wrists. She was wearing gloves, dark wool, but the cuff of the right one had been pushed up, and above it, against the pale skin of her forearm, there were marks. Red, raw, the kind that came from rope drawn tight and held. He looked at them for only a second, then looked at her face. Her expression hadn't changed. "What happened to the driver?" he asked. "He was paid to get me off this road," she said. "He was paid more than you paid for this arrangement, I imagine. He stopped the wagon, someone else was waiting, they tied me and left me here, and he drove away." She said it the same way someone might report a delayed shipment. Flatly. Like she'd already spent whatever panic she had and was now operating purely on what was left. "Someone paid him to leave you here," Wyatt said. "In a blizzard." "Yes." "Do you know who?" "I have some ideas," she said. "But I don't have proof, and I'm not interested in arguing about it in a snowstorm. If you're Wyatt Brennan, I'd very much like to get somewhere warm." He almost said something then, almost made a comment about the letters, about finally hearing her voice, about the strange, compressed unreality of meeting her this way. Like this, with rope marks on her wrists and snow in her hair, and the wind driving hard from the north. But none of that was what the moment needed. "I'm Wyatt," he said. "Come on, Tot." Buck could carry two when he had to. Wyatt helped Clara up first, and she managed it with a controlled care that impressed him. No flailing, no panic, just the deliberate and slightly painful process of getting onto a horse with a bad ankle. He mounted behind her and turned Buck back toward the pass. She held herself upright during the ride, which he respected. She didn't lean into him more than the balance of the horse required. She asked no questions. She made no complaints. Twice she coughed. Hard. A sound that worried him, but she didn't mention it. By the time the lights of the ranch came into view, she'd been shaking steadily for 20 minutes. Not the trembling of cold alone. There was something in it that felt like the aftermath of held-back fear finally beginning to surface now that safety was near. He recognized it. He'd seen it in his own hands after hard things. Emily was in the main room when they came through the door, sitting at the table with a book she'd been pretending to read for the last 2 hours. She was up before Wyatt had even gotten his coat off, standing 3 feet back with her arms at her sides, and her eyes moving carefully between her father and this woman who was none of the things Emily had built up in her imagination over 7 months of knowing the letters were coming. Clara Whitmore was not small and gentle-looking. She was tall, taller than Emily had pictured, with dark hair that had come half loose and a bearing that, even in the clear distress of cold and injury, managed to convey a certain settled quality, like she was accustomed to arriving in difficult circumstances and making the best of them. She looked at Emily, and Emily looked back. "You must be Emily," Clara said. Her voice was still a little tight from the cold, but it was warm in its intention. "Your father talks about you in his letters. Not as much as he probably should, but enough for me to get a clear picture." Emily blinked. "He doesn't write about me?" "He writes about you," Clara said. "He just tries to make it sound like he's being practical about it. It doesn't work." She glanced at Wyatt. "He can't hide that he loves you. It comes through whether he means it to or not." Emily turned to look at her father, and Wyatt had absolutely nothing to say to that, which was itself an admission of some kind. Sit her down, he said to no one in particular, and went to build up the fire. Nora Pruitt came over from the foreman's cottage within the hour, called by Dale, who'd seen the lights. She was a stout, efficient woman in her 50s who took one look at Clara's wrists and her ankle and set about taking charge of both in a way that allowed no argument. She heated water, she made a compress, she brought spare blankets and a thick wool dress that was 2 sizes too large and would have to do until Clara's trunk was retrieved from wherever it had ended up. Clara submitted to all of this with what Wyatt was beginning to recognize as her characteristic mode: cooperative but watchful, grateful but not prostrate about it. She didn't perform distress, and she didn't perform recovery. She just was what she was in each moment. Wyatt sat across the room while Nora worked and tried not to watch too obviously. "You should eat," he said at one point. "I know," Clara said. "I intend to." "Nora makes a good stew. I can smell it. It's the main thing keeping me from losing my composure entirely." That surprised a short, low sound out of him. Not quite a laugh, but close. She noticed. "You have a quiet sense of humor," she said. "So do you," he said, "from the letters." "Mine is a coping mechanism," she said. "What's yours?" He thought about it. "Probably the same." She looked at him for a moment, steady, assessing, and then she nodded, as if that was a satisfactory answer, and turned back to letting Nora wrap her ankle. Emily helped carry the stew bowls, which she didn't usually do without being asked, and she sat close to Clara at the table rather than in her usual spot at the corner. Wyatt noticed but didn't comment. Emily was not a child who could be pushed into anything. She arrived at her own conclusions on her own schedule, and the best thing anyone could do was stay out of the way. "Does it hurt a lot?" Emily asked, looking at Clara's wrapped ankle. "Not as much as it did," Claire said. "What about your wrists?" There was a brief pause. Clara glanced at Wyatt, then back at Emily. "They're sore," she said. "They'll be fine." "Someone tied you up?" "Emily," Wyatt started. "It's all right," Clara said. To Emily, "Yes, someone didn't want me to get here." Emily considered this with the gravity of a child processing an adult wrong. "Why?" "That's a good question," Claire said. "I've been thinking about it for most of the afternoon. I don't have the whole answer yet." "But you're going to figure it out?" "I'm going to try." Emily seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her stew, and the fire crackled in the grate, and outside the blizzard pressed against the windows with a sound like something trying to get in and being refused. Later, after Emily had gone to bed, and Nora had gone back to the cottage, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a cold Montana night, Wyatt sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at nothing in particular. Clara came and sat across from him. She'd combed her hair back, and her color was better, though she still held herself with the slight deliberateness of someone in some degree of pain. "I should tell you what I think happened," she said. "You don't have to tonight." "I know, but I'd rather." She folded her hands on the table. "My late fiancé, the one before I wrote to the agency, his name was Edmund Hale. He died 8 months ago. I was told it was illness, and I believed it because there was no reason not to. But after his death, there was a dispute over his estate. He had property, land mostly, and some business holdings, and a man named Silas Crow had been trying to acquire it for 2 years before Edmund died." "Crow," Wyatt said. He kept his voice level. Clara looked at him. "You know him." "I know of him. He's a banker out of Garrison. He's been buying up land in this county for the better part of 5 years. Then you may also know that when he can't buy something, he finds other ways to acquire it." She paused. "I was named in Edmund's will. Not for much. A small parcel of land that Edmund had promised me before we were married, personal sentiment more than value, but it was enough to complicate what Crow wanted. I've been trying to understand for months why he would go to the lengths he apparently went to tonight, having me detained, left in a blizzard, over something so small." "Maybe it's not small," Wyatt said. "Maybe it isn't," she agreed. "But I don't know enough yet." She looked at him steadily. "I came to Montana to marry you and build a life. That's still what I want. But I think I brought something with me that I didn't know I was carrying, and I think you deserve to know that before you decide whether this arrangement is still something you want." Wyatt looked at her. This woman he'd known in letters for 7 months, this stranger with rope marks on her wrists and stew on the table, and a tired, direct honesty in her face that hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. "You were left in a blizzard tonight," he said. "To die, most likely." "Yes." "And your first concern is telling me the situation so I can decide to back out." "I think that's the right thing to do." "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name aloud, and it sounded different than it had in his head all these months. "I rode out in a blizzard to pick you up from a coach that wasn't where it was supposed to be. I'm not a man who does things like that and then changes his mind about them." She was quiet for a moment. "That's good to know," she said finally. "I wasn't sure from the letters." "What did the letters tell you?" "That you're a man who chooses his words carefully, which could mean either someone who means them exactly or someone who says what seems right without having thought it all the way through." She tilted her head slightly. "I wasn't sure which." "I mean them exactly," he said. "All right," she said. "Then I'll take you at your word." They sat for a while in the quiet, not a comfortable quiet yet, not the ease of people who know each other, but the particular quality of two people who are beginning the long work of becoming familiar to each other and finding, maybe with some relief, that the other person seems willing to do the same. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "I know." She pushed her chair back carefully, favoring her ankle. "Where?" "Guest room's at the end of the hall. Nora made it up before she left." "Thank you." She stood. Then at the doorway she paused. "The sign on your road," she said. "The one with the ranch name on it. I saw it for about half a second before the snow covered everything. Is it hand-carved?" He looked up. "My wife made it," he said, 8 years ago." She nodded once, not a small nod, but a considered one, as if she was filing something important. "It's good work," she said, and then she was gone down the hall, and Wyatt was alone with the cold coffee and the wind and the complicated, unsteady feeling of something changing that you're not entirely ready for, but know better than to refuse. He checked the locks on the doors before he turned in. He didn't usually bother. The ranch was remote, the nearest neighbor 3 miles out, and in 8 years he'd never had cause for real concern. But tonight he went through each room deliberately, testing latches, looking at windows. Someone had paid a driver to leave a woman tied up in a blizzard on a mountain road. That was not a small thing. That was not the action of a man with limited reach or limited commitment to what he wanted. Silas Crow had been operating in Garrison County for 5 years, and in that time he'd acquired 4 properties, forced 2 families off land they'd held for a generation, and maneuvered himself into a position of influence at the bank and on the town council that made him difficult to challenge directly. Wyatt had never had reason to deal with him. His ranch was financially stable, his debts manageable, his title to the land clean and documented going back to his original purchase. He wondered how long that had felt like protection. Bustic. In the morning, the storm had passed and left everything white and still and blindingly bright under a sky that had turned a hard, clear blue. Emily was up first, which was unusual. Wyatt found her at the kitchen window, looking toward the guest room door. "She's still sleeping," he said. "I know, I was just checking." She turned to look at him. "Is she going to stay?" "Yes." "Even with the trouble?" He paused. "Who told you there was trouble?" "I'm 9, Papa," Emily said, with the particular weariness of a child who has learned that adults consistently underestimate how much children understand. "I heard you talking last night." He sat down at the table. Outside, Buck was visible through the window, moving along the fence line, his gray coat nearly invisible against the snow. "There's going to be some difficulty," he said, "with a man in town who doesn't want her here." "Why not?" "Because she has something he wants, or she stands between him and something he wants. It's not fully clear yet." Emily thought about this. "Are you going to let him take it?" Wyatt looked at his daughter, 9 years old, with her mother's eyes and her own particular brand of quiet ferocity. "No," he said. "Good," said Emily, and went to start breakfast. Clara came out of the guest room an hour later, walking carefully on her ankle, and Emily set a plate in front of her without being asked. Clara looked at the plate, then at Emily, and something moved through her expression that she controlled quickly. Gratitude and something older and more tired underneath it, the look of someone who'd learned not to count on small kindnesses. "Thank you," she said. "It's eggs," Emily said. "I didn't burn them this time." This time. Wyatt said. Last Thursday was an accident, Emily said with great dignity. Clara smiled. Not a performance of a smile, but an actual one, the kind that changes the whole face. Wyatt saw it and looked away. Dale appeared at the kitchen door with the news that he'd sent 2 men back toward Harmon's Pass to look for Clara's trunk, and that they'd found it half a mile off the road, left in a ditch. The lock had been forced. Some things inside were missing. Wyatt didn't ask which things, and Clara's expression told him she already knew, but most of it was intact. They'd bring it up to the house by midday. Thank you, Clara said to Dale, for sending them. Wasn't a thing, Dale said, in the way of men who don't take credit for decent acts. Was. After breakfast, after Dale had gone back to his work and Emily had been sent to her lessons, Clara and Wyatt sat at the cleared table, and she told him the rest of it. The specifics she hadn't told him the night before. The names, the timeline, the precise nature of the property in question, the letter she'd received 2 weeks before leaving Pennsylvania that had warned her, in careful and deliberately untraceable language, that her journey west was not advisable. She'd come anyway. Why? He asked. She looked at her hands for a moment. Because staying would have meant letting him win, and because... She stopped. Because? Because your letters made it seem worth the risk, she said. She said it flatly, without decoration, the way she said most things. But the color in her face shifted slightly. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm glad you came, he said finally. Ask me again in a few weeks, she said. Once we see how difficult this gets, I'll ask you again in a few weeks, he said. The answer will be the same. Outside, the morning light was cutting hard and bright across the snow, and somewhere in the upper pasture, one of his dogs was barking at something in the tree line, and the ranch was making all its usual sounds. The sounds of work and animals and a particular corner of the world going about its ordinary business. Clara Whitmore put her coffee cup down and looked out the window at all of it, and her expression was careful but not closed. Waiting, maybe, or deciding. The blizzard had passed. Silas Crow, Wyatt was certain, had not. Whatever was coming, it was not finished with them yet. The snow stayed for 4 more days. It wasn't the kind of extended blizzard that buried a place entirely. It was the stubborn, grinding kind, where the storm had technically passed but left behind a cold that settled into the ground and the bones of the house and refused to lift. The roads in and out of the Brennan Ranch stayed impassable through Wednesday. Dale checked them each morning and came back with the same report. Packed ice on the pass, drifts across the lower flat, nothing moving that didn't have 4 legs, and a choice about whether to bother. For Wyatt, who had lived alone with Emily and the rhythms of the ranch for 4 years, those 4 days were an education and adjustment he hadn't fully anticipated. Clara was not a difficult person to have in a house. That was the thing he kept arriving at whenever he tried to take stock of the situation honestly. She didn't require attention. She didn't fill silence with unnecessary noise. She moved through the rooms with a careful economy, as if she was conscious of the space she occupied and didn't want to presume on it. Her ankle improved steadily. By the second day, she was walking without the pronounced limp. By the third, she'd refused the compress entirely, and Nora had given up arguing about it. What she was, Wyatt realized gradually, was present, not in the demanding way, just there, sitting at the table with her mending when he came in from the morning rounds, helping Emily with the arithmetic she'd been avoiding for a week, not through instruction so much as sitting beside her and working through it with her until it stopped being a wall. Standing at the window in the evenings looking out at the dark with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be comfortable in her own head. He found himself noticing her more than he intended to. He also noticed that she watched the road. Not obviously. She didn't stand at the window with her arms crossed waiting for something to come down it, but there was a quality of alertness in her when she was near the windows that faced the access lane, a slight quickening that she controlled so well it was almost invisible. He would have missed it entirely if he hadn't been paying attention. He was paying more attention than he'd expected to. On the third morning, he asked her directly. They were in the kitchen, Emily still asleep, the coffee hot on the stove, and she was looking at the lane. "You think someone's coming?" he said. She didn't pretend she didn't know what he meant. "I think it's possible." "Crow doesn't know you survived," he said. "Whoever he paid to leave you out there, they would have assumed—" "People like Silas Crow don't assume," she said. "They verify." She turned from the window and sat at the table. "He'll find out. Maybe he already has. The driver would have gone somewhere, and somewhere has people, and people talk. It's only a matter of time before word reaches him that I'm here. And then she picked up her coffee cup. And then he'll do something else, she said. He won't come after me directly. That's not how men like him operate. He'll find another angle, something that looks legal, something that puts the pressure on you instead of me, so you become the problem, not him. Wyatt sat down across from her. You've dealt with him before. Not Crow specifically, she said, but men who operate the same way. When Edmund died, there were 2 other men who moved on his estate before the body was cold. Different methods, same logic. She looked at the table for a moment. I spent 6 months in Pennsylvania watching them use every legal and social tool available to squeeze me out of what Edmund had left me. A woman alone, with no family, no money for proper legal counsel. It wasn't a fair fight. I lost. What did you lose? The land. A small parcel, farmland mostly, not worth much in money. But Edmund had promised it to me before he got sick, and it was the first thing that would have been mine, that I'd earned, that wasn't tied to someone else's charity or someone else's plan for me. She said it plainly, without self-pity, but the flatness of her voice was doing some work. I came out here because staying would have meant giving them the rest of it too. My peace, my future, all of it. The land Crow wants here, Wyatt said. Is it connected to Edmund's estate? I believe so. There was a business arrangement between Edmund and someone in Montana. I never got the full details, but his papers mentioned a holding, some kind of joint interest in property near Garrison. I think Crow knew about it. I think he's been trying to untangle it for years, and the one remaining thread runs through me. She met his eyes. Which makes me inconvenient. Inconvenient enough to leave in a blizzard, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had come 3,000 miles carrying a problem she hadn't fully understood yet, who had sat in his house for 3 days and hadn't asked him for reassurance once, who had just laid out the geometry of her own vulnerability with the precision of someone who'd learned that false comfort is worse than none. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, what? All right, we figure out what the connection is. What property, what interest, what exactly he's after. If we know what it is, we know how to defend against it. She was quiet for a second. That's a significant commitment of time and resources for a problem that isn't technically yours. Clara, he said, and he heard himself use her name the same way he had that first night. Direct, finished, as if it settled something. You came here to be part of this ranch, this family. That means your problems are mine. That's not negotiosity. That's how it works. She looked at him steadily for a long moment. You're going to have to stop being reasonable, she said finally. It's making it very hard to maintain my composure. It surprised another one of those almost laughs out of him. He turned to the stove to hide it. The roads cleared on Thursday, and the world came back in with it. Dale's work crews resuming their rounds, supply wagons making their way up from Garrison, the ordinary machinery of a working ranch shifting back into gear. And with the world came news, carried in by Dale's youngest hand, a gap-toothed 19-year-old named Clem who picked up gossip the way other people picked up stray dogs. Town's talking about the woman, Clem told Dale, who told Wyatt, who listened without expression. What are they saying? Dale hesitated in the way he had when he wasn't sure how much to tell. Saying she's trouble. Saying she came from back east with some history following her. He paused. Saying she was involved in something, with a man who died. Wyatt went still. Who's saying it? It's coming from the bank. From Crow's people. Dale looked at his hands. Wyatt, they're saying she killed him. He told Clara that evening after Emily was in bed. He told her straight, because she would have wanted it that way, and she heard him out without interrupting, and when he was done, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Edmund, she said. It wasn't a question. I assume so. He didn't die of illness, she said. Then she stopped. Then she said with a careful evenness that cost her something. I was told he died of illness. His family told me. There was no suggestion of anything else. No investigation, no questions. He was sick, and then he died, and they buried him. And 2 weeks later, the lawyers started appearing. But now someone's saying otherwise. Now Silas Crow is saying otherwise, she corrected, which means either he's fabricated it entirely, which is possible, or he knows something about Edmund's death that wasn't made public, and he's using it. She pressed her lips together. Either way, the story serves him. A woman accused of killing a man is a woman no one will believe about anything else. Wyatt had been thinking the same thing. I need to know, he said. Whatever the truth is, all of it. Not because I doubt you, because we can't defend against something we don't understand. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something shift in her face that wasn't the usual controlled steadiness. Something that was almost relief, and almost pain, and almost gratitude, all compressed together into an expression that she closed off almost immediately. I don't know all of it, she said. I know Edmund was not well when I last saw him. I know the illness came on fast, faster than made sense to me at the time, though I told myself I wasn't a doctor. I know that Crow had been pressuring him for months over the property, and I know that Edmund had refused him every time. And I know... She paused. I know Edmund was afraid of something in the last weeks. He didn't say it directly, but I knew him well enough to see it. Afraid of Crow? Afraid of something Crow could do, she said, or had already done. The fire settled in the grate, and outside the wind had started again, softer than the blizzard, just a steady push against the north side of the house. If Crow killed him, Wyatt said carefully, then he needs someone to take the blame for it, Clara finished, and I'm the most convenient candidate. She said it steadily, but her hands had closed on each other on the table. A woman from out east, no family, no money, no one to speak for her. She travels west under suspicious circumstances, or circumstances that can be made to look suspicious. And if she'd died in that blizzard, the story would have stayed exactly where Crow wanted it. An accused woman fled to escape justice, disappeared in a Montana winter. Wyatt looked at her hands. She noticed him looking and separated them, laying them flat again. I'm not going to let that happen, he said. I know, she said. But I need you to understand how serious this is. He has money and influence and whatever story he's chosen to tell. We have what we know and whatever proof we can find and whatever goodwill you've built in this town over however many years. 23 years, he said. Is it enough? He thought about it honestly. For some people, he said, not all of them. She nodded. That's an honest answer. You asked for an honest one. I did. She pushed back from the table and stood. Then we'd better find what proof there is before he finishes building his case. She looked at him. I have some papers, what's left of them after his men went through my trunk. There's a letter Edmund sent me 3 weeks before he died. I didn't understand it fully at the time. I've been carrying it since Pennsylvania, reading it every few weeks, trying to find what I missed. Can I see it? Yes, she said, but not tonight. Tonight I need to think clearly, and I'm running low on clear. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he said. She went down the hall, and he sat alone with the dying fire. And he thought about Silas Crow sitting in his office in Garrison, building a story with the patience and precision of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. He thought about Clara with rope marks on her wrists, standing in the snow, managing herself carefully because panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. He thought about 23 years in this valley, his name on this land, and what it meant to have built something that a man like Crow might think he could use as leverage. The fire went to coals. He didn't rebuild it. He sat with the dark for a while and let himself think, which was something he'd gotten out of the habit of doing and was going to have to relearn. Emily found out the next morning. Not from Wyatt, from Clem, who had the discretion of a leaky bucket and had mentioned it to one of the kitchen hands without thinking, and the kitchen hand had mentioned it near the window where Emily was sitting reading. Wyatt discovered this when he came in from the barn and found his daughter standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her expression at its most severe, which was very severe. They're saying Clara killed someone, Emily said. Wyatt took his coat off. Who's they? Clem, and now probably everyone else. Clem doesn't know what he's talking about. Did she? No. He said it without hesitation, because he didn't have any hesitation about it, which was something he'd already settled in himself overnight. She didn't. Emily held his gaze for a moment, checking him for the particular quality of certainty that children know is different from the quality of someone saying what they think you need to hear. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. Is someone trying to get her in trouble? She asked. Yes. The same person who had her left in the snow? I think so. Emily unfolded her arms. What are we going to do? Wyatt almost smiled at the we. We're going to be careful, he said, and smart and patient. He sat down. And you're not going to repeat anything you hear from Clem or anyone else until we know more. Can you do that? Obviously, said Emily, with the dignity of someone who found the question slightly insulting. Clara brought him the letter after breakfast, while Emily was at her lessons and Dale had taken the crew out to check the north fence line. She set it on the table between them. A single folded page, the paper soft with handling, the ink slightly faded at the folds where it had been opened and closed many times. He read it carefully. Edmund Hale's handwriting was uneven, pressured, the letters crowding each other as if written in haste or distress. The letter was dated 6 weeks before his death. Most of it was personal, the kind of writing a man does when he's trying to say something important without saying it directly, circling around it, feeling for the words. But 2 paragraphs stood out. I have made arrangements with a man in Montana, property arrangements that I believe are sound and will serve you well in time. I cannot describe them more fully in writing, as I have reason to believe my correspondence is being read. Trust that the arrangements exist and that they are documented. If anything should happen to me before we are married, there is a record. Find it. And lower, near the end. Clara, I want you to know that I have been a coward in some things, and I am trying to correct it. There are men who will tell you I was weak. They may not be wrong, but I did not give them everything they wanted. That much I can say honestly. Wyatt set the letter down. Property arrangements that I believe are sound, Shatem, he said. He's talking about the Montana holding, the one connected to Crow. That's what I believe, yes, Clara said. He'd set up some kind of formal arrangement, documented somewhere, he says. But I've never found it. His family controlled the estate after his death, and they were not cooperative. They were working with Crow? I don't know if they knew it. They may have just been eager to settle the estate quickly. People often are. She looked at the letter. He says there's a record. I spent 2 months looking for it in Pennsylvania and found nothing. Because the record's here, Wyatt said. She looked at him. A man in Montana, he said. If Edmund set up the arrangement from his end, the documentation would be at both ends. Whatever was recorded in Pennsylvania, Crow's people probably already found and destroyed. But if there's a copy here, with whoever Edmund made the arrangement with, it still exists. Clara was very still. Do you know who Edmund might have dealt with in Garrison County? I can find out, he said. There aren't many people here who handle that kind of property arrangement. The land office, a couple of attorneys, the county clerk. He paused. And the bank. She absorbed that. Crow's bank. Crow's bank, he said, which means either the record's in Crow's hands already, or it's somewhere else and he's been looking for it, or, and this is the part that matters, he doesn't know exactly where it is, and that's why he needed you dead. Because if you showed up here alive and started asking questions, you might find it first. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. He needed me gone before I could look, she said slowly. Not because of what I know, because of what I might find. That changes things, Wyatt said. It means the proof still exists somewhere. It means it might. She pressed her fingers against the table. Where do we start? The county clerk's office, he said. Property records are public. If Edmund filed anything, any instrument, any agreement, any transfer, it'll be there. Crow can have influence over the bank and over the town council, but he can't walk into the county records office and remove a registered document without someone knowing. When can we go? He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to move fast. He did. But because the practical part of his mind was already running through the problem. We go to Garrison together, and people are going to see you, he said. The story Crow is spreading is already out there. You walk into that town and there will be reactions. I know. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about almost nothing else for 3 days, she said, with a dryness that acknowledged both the seriousness and her own particular way of carrying it. I'm not afraid of being looked at, Wyatt. I've been looked at my whole life. I'd rather face it directly than hide out here and let the story take root without anything to push against it. He looked at her. This woman who'd come all this way and taken the rope marks and the blizzard and the accusation and was sitting at his kitchen table talking about facing it directly with the same tone she used to discuss whether the coffee needed reheating. "All right," he said. "We go Friday. I have business at the supply house anyway. We go together, keep it ordinary. I stop at the clerk's office while you're—" "I'll go with you to the clerk's office," she said. "Clara, if I hide, it looks like hiding. If I walk in beside you and behave like a woman who has nothing to be ashamed of, it looks like what it is." She met his eyes. "I know the difference matters. I've learned it the hard way." He couldn't argue with the logic. He didn't try. Gone. It was Dale's wife, Nora, who told them about the second visitor, the one who arrived on Thursday afternoon while Wyatt was out checking the south pasture and Clara was in the house with Emily. Nora came to the door herself, which she usually didn't bother with. Visitors to the ranch went to the main house directly, and Nora had her own cottage and her own schedule. But she'd seen the horse, and she'd recognized it, and she'd come to warn them because the warning mattered. "Silas Crow is at your gate," she told Clara, who had answered the door. Clara looked at her. "I thought you should know before he got to the house," Nora said. "In case you wanted to—" She stopped. "Actually, I don't know what you'd want to do. I just thought you should know." "Thank you," Clara said. "I appreciate the warning." She did not hide. She went back into the main room, told Emily to go to her room and stay there, and stood at the window and watched the man ride up the lane. She'd never seen Silas Crow, but she knew him immediately the way you know certain people. Not from their face, but from the way they move, with the particular unhurried ease of men who have not been refused in a long time and have begun to mistake that for a natural condition. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed for a ranch call, with a heavy gray mustache and careful eyes, and the manner of someone who had thought through every version of this conversation in advance. He was tying his horse to the post when Wyatt rode in from the south pasture. Clara watched through the window as Wyatt saw Crow and stopped, and the two men looked at each other across the yard. She couldn't hear what was said. She would only find out later, from Wyatt, in the kitchen, with the kind of flat and careful precision that told her he'd spent the ride back deciding what to leave in and what to leave out before deciding to just tell her all of it. Crow had been civil. He was always civil, apparently. That was his method. He'd spoken in the measured tones of a man paying a neighborly call, asked after the ranch, mentioned the storm, said he hoped the winter hadn't caused too much damage. And then he'd said, "I imagine you've heard some of the talk in town, Brennan, about the woman you've taken in." Wyatt had said he'd heard some of it. "Then you know the situation," Crow had said. "A woman with a serious accusation against her name. A dead man back east, questions about the circumstances. I don't know your arrangement with her, but I'd be cautious. Harboring someone that particular kind of trouble follows can create complications for a man. Business complications, community complications." He'd paused. "I've always had a great deal of respect for what you've built here. I'd hate to see it jeopardized." Wyatt had looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate your concern," he'd said. "Is that all you needed?" Crow had smiled, the smile of a man who'd expected something more to push against. "For now," he'd said, and mounted his horse and rode back down the lane. Clara heard all of this sitting across the kitchen table from Wyatt that evening, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. "He came in person," she said. "Yes. He didn't have to do that. He could have sent someone or sent a message. He came himself." She looked at the table. "He came to see whether I was actually here and to take your measure." "I know." "What did he see?" Wyatt considered the question. "I don't know exactly. I didn't give him much." "Did he believe you'd send me away?" "No," Wyatt said. "I don't think he came here believing that. I think he came here to establish the opening terms. To let me know he's watching and that there's a price for standing beside you and to see if I'd flinch." "Did you?" He met her eyes. "What do you think?" She held his gaze for a moment. "I think you didn't," she said. "But I also think the price he mentioned wasn't the real price. The real one comes later. That's how men like him work. They give you the polite version first, and if that doesn't work, they start removing things." "Then we'd better find that document before he decides the polite version hasn't worked," Wyatt said. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. "İşte." The night before they were to ride into Garrison, Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway after she was supposed to have been asleep. She was in her nightdress with her hair loose, which she only did when she was unsettled enough to forget to plait it. Wyatt was still at the table. Clara had gone to bed an hour earlier. "Papa," Emily said, "you should be asleep." "I know. Is she going to have to leave?" Wyatt looked at his daughter. "No," he said, "but if the town—" "She's not leaving," he said. "Nobody's running her off from here. Not from this ranch." Emily stood in the doorway for a moment. She had a habit of processing things in silence, standing absolutely still in a way that had unnerved visitors who didn't know her and had always struck Wyatt as the most Rose-like thing about her. "She read to me today," Emily said finally, "after my lessons. She didn't offer, I just asked, and she just did it, without making it into a whole thing." Wyatt said nothing. "She reads like she means it," Emily said, "like the story matters." A pause. "Mama used to do that." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," Wyatt said. Emily looked at him with those dark eyes that saw too clearly and had seen too much for their years. "I don't want her to go," she said, and it was a statement, not a plea. Emily didn't plead, had never quite learned how, but the weight in it was the same. "Go to bed," Wyatt said gently. "She's not going anywhere." Emily went. Wyatt sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, with the fire burning low and the ranch settled around him and the full accumulated weight of the situation pressing on him from multiple directions at once. Crow's visit. The story spreading through Garrison. The document that might or might not exist. Clara's steady hands and the rope marks fading on her wrists, and the letter from a dead man who had been afraid of something. And Emily, standing in the doorway in her nightdress, saying she reads like she means it. He thought about the morning he'd ridden out in the blizzard, and Dale standing in the stable door saying the storm was getting worse, and how he'd known then, somewhere below the practical reasoning about covenants and commitments and the simple fact that she needed to be picked up, that he was riding towards something that mattered, that the thing he'd been building without quite knowing it for 4 years, the life he'd been managing and maintaining and holding together with competent hands and a careful distance from anything that required him to feel too much, was about to change in some way he couldn't fully see. He'd been right about that. The road into Garrison was 30 miles of frozen ruts and cold, clear sky. Whatever waited for them there, they'd face it on Friday. He was not afraid. Or he was, a little. But that was different from letting it stop him. Friday came in cold and clear. The kind of Montana morning that looked beautiful from inside a window and felt like a fist to the face the moment you stepped out into it. The sky was the hard blue of deep winter, cloudless, the sun offering light without any particular commitment to warmth. By the time Wyatt had the wagon hitched and Buck tied to the back, his breath was coming in steady plumes and his fingers had gone stiff in his gloves. Clara came out of the house dressed practically. A dark wool coat, good boots, her hair pinned back under a hat that had survived the wreck of her trunk better than most things. She carried herself the same way she always did, which was upright and without ceremony, and she climbed onto the wagon seat without assistance, which he'd learned by now was not stubbornness so much as a general preference for managing herself. Emily stood on the porch and watched them go. She'd asked to come and been told no, which she'd accepted without argument, another sign, Wyatt had come to understand, that she'd already worked through the reasoning herself and arrived at the same conclusion. She raised one hand as the wagon pulled out, and Clara raised one back. They didn't speak much for the first several miles. The road was frozen solid, ruts from earlier traffic locked into the surface like a record of every wagon that had passed before them, and Wyatt kept his attention on the horses and the grade as they came down through the lower pass. Clara watched the country. The Gallatin Valley opened up to the south, white and enormous, the mountains on the far edge of it looking close in the cold, clear air the way they never did in summer. "It's beautiful," she said, after a long quiet. "It is," he said. "I didn't see it properly when I arrived. Too dark, too cold, too occupied with other things." "You'll see more of it," he said. She glanced at him. He was looking at the road. She turned back to the valley. "I used to think Pennsylvania was large," she said. "The part of it I knew. The county, the towns, the farms going back up the hillsides. It felt like it was all there was. She paused. This makes everything I knew feel like a room. Montana does that. Does it still do it to you after 23 years? He thought about it honestly. On certain mornings, he said, when the light is right. She nodded, as if that was the correct answer. They rode on. Garrison was not a large town. It had a main street that ran 4 blocks, a rail depot that handled freight more than passengers, 2 hotels, 3 saloons, a dry goods store, a hardware merchant, a land office, the county courthouse and clerk's building, and the Garrison Territorial Bank, which occupied the largest and most permanently constructed building on the street. Solid stone, 2 stories, with a painted sign above the door that had been recently refreshed. The name on the sign was Crow. Wyatt pulled the wagon up in front of the supply house and tied the horses. He helped Clara down, not because she needed it, but because the street was icy and it was the sensible thing to do. They went into the supply house together and he handled his business. A list of materials for fence repair, some dry goods that Nora had requested, a new axle pin for the smaller wagon that had been cracked since November. The proprietor, a lean man named Gatch, who'd known Wyatt for 15 years, was friendly in the distracted way of someone dealing with a busy morning. He nodded to Clara without particular comment. Outside was different. They stepped onto the main street and walked toward the courthouse end, and Wyatt felt the change before he could have named exactly what changed. It was a quality of attention, the kind that shifts a street's ambient noise by a few degrees, the way a room changes when someone notable walks in. A woman on the opposite walkway looked up from her shopping and looked at Clara with an expression that started neutral and moved into something else. 2 men outside the hardware store stopped their conversation. A boy of 12 who'd been sweeping the step of the hotel stopped sweeping and stared openly until someone inside called him back. Clara noticed all of it. She walked beside him with her chin level and her pace steady, and she said nothing. The county clerk's office was inside the courthouse building, which required going through the main entrance hall and past a heavy oak door with county records stenciled on the frosted glass. The clerk was a man named Aldous Fitch, who Wyatt knew slightly. They'd had dealings over the original title paperwork when Wyatt had expanded the ranch 8 years back. Fitch was 50-ish, meticulous, with small spectacles and the permanent ink stains on his right hand that come from decades of writing in ledgers. He looked up when they came in, recognized Wyatt, started to smile, and then his eyes moved to Clara and his expression went through a small and not particularly well-concealed adjustment. "Brennan," he said, "what can I do for you?" "Property records," Wyatt said. "I'm looking for any registered instrument tied to a parcel of land. Could be filed under a few different names. The former owner may have been an Edmund Hale out of Pennsylvania. Could also be under a Montana party, someone local, filed sometime in the last 2 years. Fitch looked at him. Then he looked at Clara, then back at Wyatt. "This related to the Kellerman tract?" Wyatt went still. "What tract?" "Old Kellerman land, north of town, up the ridge. About 300 acres, mostly timber, some grazing." Fitch looked uncertain, as if he'd said something he wasn't sure he should have. "It's had some activity recently in the records." "What kind of activity?" "Someone filed a claim of interest last month on behalf of an Eastern party." He hesitated. "There was a counterfiling a week later from the bank." "Crow," Clara said. Fitch looked at her directly for the first time. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I should be—" "The original filing," Wyatt said. "The one from the Eastern party. Is it still on record?" "Everything filed here stays on record," Fitch said, with the mild affront of a man for whom this was a point of professional pride. "I don't remove filed instruments. Nobody does. That's the point of filing them." "Can I see it?" A pause. Fitch looked at the door behind them, then back at Wyatt. He looked like a man doing a private calculation about costs and what side of something he was going to land on. Then he went to the filing cabinets along the far wall and pulled out a ledger. The original filing was 2 pages. Wyatt read it standing at the counter, with Clara beside him reading the same lines. It was dense with legal language, the kind of document that had been carefully constructed to say precisely what it meant and nothing more. But the core of it was clear. Edmund Hale, of Pennsylvania, in partnership with one Harlan Vesper of Garrison, Montana, had registered a joint interest in the Kellerman tract, with a provision that in the event of Hale's death, His interest would pass to his named beneficiary, Clara Whitmore, pending marriage or other legal verification of the relationship. Wyatt heard Clara inhale quietly beside him. The interest was substantial, 300 acres of timberland, which in the current market, with the rail expansion pushing into the territory and lumber prices rising, was worth significantly more than farmland. Worth enough that a man who wanted it would go to considerable lengths. Harlan Vesper, Wyatt said. Do you know him? Knew him, Fitch said. He died. About 3 months ago. He paused. Hart, they said. The three of them stood in the small office with that information settling around them like sediment. Who inherited his interest? Clara asked. Fitch looked at the counter. His estate was handled by the bank, he said quietly. Crow's Bank, Wyatt said. I don't know the specific details of the estate. That's not county records. That's private banking business. Fitch took his spectacles off and cleaned them with a careful, slightly unnecessary thoroughness. But the counterfiling that the bank made, it claims that Vesper's interest passed to the bank as a creditor of the estate, and that without the corresponding Eastern interest being verified, the full property defaults to them. Without my interest being verified, Clara said, which it can't be if I'm dead, or accused of murder and unable to establish legal standing. Fitch put his spectacles back on and said nothing. Can we get a copy of this filing? Wyatt asked. I can make you one, Fitch said. It's public record. Anyone can request a copy. He looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man communicating something he'd rather not say aloud. Anyone who's been here this week has already requested one. They were back on the main street with the copy folded in Wyatt's coat when the trouble began in earnest. It started the way these things always start, not with a confrontation, but with a gathering. 3 men outside the saloon, then 2 more from the direction of the bank. A woman who'd been watching from across the street, now on the same side of it. The change in the street's attention that Wyatt had felt when they first arrived had sharpened into something with edges. He kept walking toward the wagon. Clara kept pace beside him. Brennan, the voice came from the direction of the bank. Wyatt turned. Silas Crow was standing on the top step of the bank, not having come down to the street level, which was a choice. You don't come down when you can address someone from above. He was dressed with the same careful deliberateness as his ranch visit, and he had 2 men flanking him who were not bank employees. I heard you were in town today, Crow said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The street had gone quiet enough that normal speech carried. I thought we might have a chance to talk. We talked at my ranch, Wyatt said. We did. I thought you might have had time to reconsider. He looked at Clara with the particular quality of a man examining something he considers already his. Miss Whitmore, I imagine you found the clerk's office informative. Informative enough, Clara said. Her voice was even. Then you understand the situation. The claim is complicated by a number of factors, not least of which is the question of your legal standing. He said it with a careful delicacy that managed to be worse than bluntness. Given the accusations in Pennsylvania, the accusations you arranged, Clara said. A small silence. The street was very quiet now. That's a serious charge, Crow said. So is murder, Clara said. The one you've been spreading about me. One of the men behind Crow shifted. A woman in the gathered crowd on the walkway said something to the person beside her, too low to hear. The attention of the street had fully turned toward this now, the way weather turns. I haven't spread anything, Crow said. I've shared information that came to me from parties in Pennsylvania. If the information is unwelcome, that's understandable, but the discomfort doesn't change its nature. He looked at Wyatt then, and the look was different. Not the public performance of the previous exchange, but something more direct, more personal. The look of a man making a private calculation visible for just a moment. Brennan, he said, you're a reasonable man. You've built something real here. I'd hate to see it damaged by an association that... Say what you mean, Wyatt said. Crow paused. The town has concerns, he said. Legitimate concerns about the character of the woman you've brought here. I'm not the only one raising them. If you were to resolve the arrangement quietly and let the matter of the Kellerman track be settled through proper channels, I think you'd find a great deal of goodwill restored very quickly. Proper channels being your bank, Wyatt said. The bank has a legitimate claim. The bank has a manufactured claim, Clara said. built on a dead man's estate and a counterfiling that only works if I don't exist to contest it. Several people in the crowd were listening closely. Wyatt could see it. The ones who were already against Clara, the ones who were uncertain, the ones who were waiting to see which way the weight shifted. He'd lived in this county for 23 years, and he knew most of these faces, and he knew their families and their disputes and their loyalties, and he understood with a clarity that came from knowing people a long time which of them Crow owned outright, and which of them were just afraid of him. He looked at Clara beside him. He looked at the document folded in his coat, which proved Edmund Hale had made a real arrangement, which proved Clara had a legitimate claim, which proved Crow had been maneuvering against it for months. He looked at the crowd, and at Crow on his step, and at the two men behind Crow, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt afraid, not for himself, for the ranch, for Emily, for the 23 years of careful building that a man with money and influence and a manufactured story could begin to dismantle in ways that would take years to fight and might not be entirely reversible. For the fact that the document in his pocket was real, but documents don't always matter as much as they should when a powerful man has already decided the outcome and started shaping the world around that decision. He stood there for 2 or 3 seconds, and in those seconds he said nothing. It wasn't much time. But Clara was standing beside him, and she felt it. He knew she felt it because he saw her shoulders change. A small adjustment, barely visible. But he'd been paying close attention to Clara Whitmore for 11 days now, and he knew the vocabulary of how she held herself, and what he saw was not a woman who'd been frightened. It was a woman who'd been confirmed in something she'd been afraid might be true. She looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not anger. It was something older and quieter and more exhausted than anger. It was recognition. "I see," she said. Her voice was very level. She turned from him. She walked. Not running. Clara would never run in a public street. But she was walking away from him, away from Crow, away from the gathered watchers, with her head level and her pace controlled and every line of her body communicating that she was done waiting for something that had just proved itself unavailable. "Clara, he said. She didn't stop. Crow, to his credit, said nothing. He watched with the expression of a man watching a situation resolve in his favor. Wyatt stood on the frozen street of Garrison, Montana, with the document in his coat and the crowd watching and Crow on his step, and he thought about fear. He'd been afraid before. He'd been afraid the night Rose got sick, and he understood the fever wasn't breaking the way it should have. He'd been afraid in the first winter after she died, when Emily stopped eating for 2 weeks, and he hadn't known how to reach her and felt the terrible insufficiency of being the only one. He'd been afraid every time he'd had to make a decision that could lose the ranch, the drought year, the bad winter, the year the cattle prices dropped, and he'd had to sit with a column of numbers and decide what to cut and what to hold. He knew what fear was. He knew what it cost when you let it drive. He'd spent 4 years being afraid of loving something and losing it again, and he'd handled that fear the only way he knew how, which was to manage his life carefully so nothing got close enough to break him if it went wrong. It had worked, more or less. He'd kept the ranch, kept Emily, kept himself functional, and then a woman with rope marks on her wrists had stood in the snow and looked at him and said, "If you're Wyatt Brennan, I'd very much like to get somewhere warm." And he'd brought her home, and she'd sat at his table and read to his daughter and laid out the geometry of her vulnerability without a single moment of performance. And somewhere in the last 11 days, the careful distance he'd been maintaining between himself and anything that could matter too much had simply stopped working. He'd already let her matter. The fear he'd just felt on that street, the 2 or 3 seconds of silence, wasn't about the ranch. He knew that now. It was the old fear wearing a new coat, the fear of standing fully beside something you could lose. He looked down the street. Clara had made it half a block. He moved. "Oh, Clara." She didn't stop. "Clara." He caught up with her and stepped around in front of her, which forced her to either stop or walk through him. She stopped. She looked at him with those dark eyes that were doing the thing he'd come to know, processing everything, giving away very little, but not nothing. Never completely nothing. "I need you to hear me," he said. "I heard you," she said. "On the street. You were very clear." "I said nothing on the street." "That's what I mean." He stood in front of her on the frozen walkway with the cold pressing in and the sound of the street behind him, and the distance Crow had put between them with 2 years of careful maneuvering and 3 seconds of silence. "I was afraid," he said. "I know. Not of him. Not of what he can do to the ranch. Or not only that." He looked at her directly, which was not easy, which was the point. "I was afraid because I've been telling myself for 11 days that this was a practical arrangement I was honoring, and when I stood on that street and had to decide what it actually was, I found out I'd been wrong about that for a while." She was listening. Her face hadn't changed, but she was listening in the particular way she had. Fully, with everything, not waiting for her turn. "I was afraid because it matters," he said. "You matter. And that's harder than I knew how to hold in the moment." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm not going back. I should have said it on the street and I didn't, and that was wrong, and I'm telling you now." A long moment passed. "Wyatt," she said. Her voice had lost some of its evenness, just slightly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going back to that street," he said, "and I'm going to say what I should have said." "It won't be quiet," she said. "Good," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the main street, and he walked beside her. Crow was still on the bank steps. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown by a few people who'd come out of the saloon to see what the stillness was about. When Wyatt came back with Clara beside him, the street went through another of those shifts, and Crow's expression moved from satisfaction to something more careful. Wyatt stopped in the middle of the street where everyone could see him. He was not a man given to speeches. He did not have the politician's instinct for the performed moment. What he had was 23 years in this valley, and a voice that carried, and the habit of saying what he meant exactly once. "I want to say something," he said, addressing the crowd as much as Crow. "For anyone who's heard what's being said about Clara Whitmore. The street was quiet. She came here to marry me. She came alone, 3,000 miles, because she believed this was a place where a person could build something honest. Someone paid a driver to strand her on a mountain road in a blizzard. Someone paid witnesses to carry a story across from Pennsylvania that I believe is false, and that I believe serves one purpose: to discredit the only person standing between Silas Crow and a property he wants and doesn't own. He could hear people, not murmuring, listening. There is a difference. I have a document in my coat from the county clerk's office that shows Edmund Hale registered a joint interest in the Kellerman tract, with Clara Whitmore as his named beneficiary. I have a letter from Hale written 6 weeks before his death, indicating he believed his correspondence was being read and that someone wanted him silenced. I have rope marks, healing now, but there, on the wrists of the woman beside me, put there by men paid to make sure she never arrived to claim what's legally hers. He looked at Crow. "I'm not a lawyer. I don't know exactly how the law works on this, but I know what happened, and I know why, and I know that if this town is willing to run a woman off on the word of the man who tried to have her killed, then whatever that says about this town, it says the same thing about me if I stand here and say nothing." He paused. "I'm not going to say nothing." A silence. Then Crow came down one step. His composure was intact, but something behind it had tightened. "Brennan, these are serious allegations." "I know they are," Wyatt said. "That's why I'm making them in public, in front of witnesses, so they're not private words that can be denied later." He looked at the crowd, the faces he knew, the ones he'd done business with and shared bad winters with and relied on and been relied upon by for more than 2 decades. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to wait for the evidence before you decide." From somewhere in this crowd, from an older man near the back who Wyatt recognized as a former town alderman, a man named Prudo, who'd been in garrison longer than Crow and had no particular love for the banker, came a voice. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that's sitting in the county clerk's files and in the records of Edmund Hale's estate in Pennsylvania," Wyatt said. "The kind that can be obtained by anyone willing to look at it honestly." Another voice, one Wyatt didn't recognize. "What about the killing back east?" "There is no case against her," Clara said. She'd been standing beside him, quiet, and her voice now was steady and clear. "There was never a formal accusation, never a trial, never a warrant issued. What there is a rumor, started here, weeks after I left Pennsylvania, by men with an interest in discrediting me. If anyone has specific evidence of a crime committed by me, I am standing in the middle of a public street and I invite them to present it." The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Crow looked at the crowd, and Wyatt could see him doing the calculation. Who he owned, who he'd lost, who was still uncertain. He looked at Wyatt. "You've made a choice," Crow said. His voice was controlled, but the warmth had left it entirely. "I hope you understand the full weight of it." "I do," Wyatt said. Crow looked at Clara. Something moved through his expression. Frustration, maybe? Or the particular cold anger of a man watching a plan fail in stages. Then he turned and went back inside the bank, and his two men followed, and the door closed. Go. The crowd didn't applaud. This wasn't that kind of story, and these weren't that kind of people. What happened was quieter and more complicated than applause. A few men looked at each other and moved away. A woman Wyatt knew from the church auxiliary came forward and introduced herself to Clara with a directness that communicated where she stood. Prudo, the old alderman, made his way over and spoke briefly with Wyatt about the county clerk's documents and the name of a lawyer he knew in the territorial capital who'd handled property disputes. Not everyone was convinced. Two men left toward the saloon with an energy that suggested they'd be talking about Brennan's performance over drinks, and not favorably. The woman who'd watched from across the street when they first arrived did not come forward. These things don't resolve all at once. They never do. But the immediate pressure, the sense of a mob forming a consensus, Crow's public moment of leverage, had dissipated. They rode home in the long blue light of a winter afternoon, the shadows stretching away from them eastward and the mountains catching the last of the sun on their peaks in a color that was almost red. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The horses knew the way. The road was familiar. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said finally. "I know. You could have found a quieter way. Written letters. Engaged a lawyer. Handled it through proper channels without standing in the middle of the street." "I could have," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because quiet ways take time," he said, "and I'd already let one moment pass on that street that shouldn't have. I didn't want to let another one." She looked ahead at the road. "Also," he said, "because he was standing up there on those steps looking at you like you were already gone, and I found I had a significant objection to that." She said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "I thought you'd changed your mind." "I know you did." "I've had people change their minds before," she said, "when things got difficult. I've come to expect it." She paused. "It's not a criticism of you. It's just what I know." "I know that too," he said, "and I'm going to have to show you it's different, not just say it." He looked at the road. "That's going to take time." "Yes," she said, "it is." The wagon moved through the cold. An owl called from somewhere in the dark tree line to the north, and Buck's ears swiveled briefly and then settled. "The man Prudhoe mentioned," Clara said, "the lawyer in the capital. I'll write to him Monday. The filing at the clerk's office establishes the claim. If we can get records from Pennsylvania, Edmund's estate records, and demonstrate the timeline of Crow's interference." "One step at a time," he said gently, because he could hear the pace of her thinking accelerating in the way it did when she was managing anxiety by converting it to planning. "I know," she said. She took a breath. "I know." A pause. "I'm not good at waiting." "I noticed," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. But the tension in how she held herself had shifted slightly. The ranch lights came into view as they came over the last low ridge, the windows yellow against the dark, the wood smoke rising from the chimney in a pale column that bent slowly east in the light evening wind. Emily had left the porch light on. "She lights it when I'm out after dark," Wyatt said. "She thinks I don't notice." "She's been doing it every evening," Clara said. He looked at her. "You noticed." "I notice things," she said. Not boastfully, just a statement of how she moved through the world. "She did it the first night, too, when you were still checking the locks." She paused. "She's been watching for you to come home her whole life. She does it so automatically she probably doesn't even know she does it." Wyatt looked at the yellow light in the window, and felt something move in his chest that he'd spent 4 years keeping very quiet. They pulled into the yard, and before the wagon had fully stopped, Emily was at the door, not stepping onto the cold porch, but visible in the open doorway, backlit by the warmth of the house. "You're late," she said. "We had business," Wyatt said, climbing down. "What kind?" "The important kind," Clara said. She was down from the wagon, and she looked up at Emily in the doorway. "We'll tell you about it inside. Is there anything left of supper?" "I kept it warm," Emily said. Then, after a beat, "It's slightly burned on the bottom. Not like last Thursday, just slightly." "Slightly burned is fine," Clara said. "Slightly burned is better than nothing." Emily stepped back to let them in, and the door closed against the cold, and outside the ranch settled into its night sounds. The horses moving in the stable, the dogs quiet at their posts, the wind beginning to pick up again from the northwest in that way it had this time of year, pushing against whatever was solid and finding out what held. Inside, the stove was warm and the supper was only slightly burned, and Emily had set the table for 3. Some things hold. The letter to the lawyer in the territorial capital went out Monday morning, carried by Clem, who was riding south anyway to collect a part from the mill. Wyatt wrote it carefully, 3 drafts before he was satisfied, and Clara read each one and suggested 2 changes that made it more precise. She had a legal mind without having had any legal training, the kind that develops in people who've had to fight institutional processes alone and learned by necessity how to read the language of documents and find where the truth was being obscured. The lawyer's name was Aldrich Marsh, and Prudo had vouched for him with the specificity of someone who'd seen the man work. Not glowing praise, just the particular endorsement of a former official who'd watched a lot of lawyers operate over a long career and knew the difference between the ones who were careful and the ones who were performing care. "He reads everything twice," Prudo had said, "and he doesn't start talking until he's done reading." In Wyatt's experience, that was the best thing you could say about someone whose job was to understand things accurately. While the letter made its way south, the ranch went about its February business, which was the least forgiving kind. The cold had settled in for what Dale said would be another 2 to 3 weeks based on the way the peaks were holding their snow. He'd been reading Montana winters for 30 years, and his predictions ran about 80% accurate, which was better than the almanac. The cattle needed daily attention, the water lines needed checking. 2 sections of the north fence that the blizzard had damaged needed patching before the thaw made the mud work impossible. Wyatt worked his regular days, which were long, and came in at dark, and ate supper with Clara and Emily, and found that this arrangement, which ought to have felt temporary or provisional, had already begun to feel, in some inconvenient and undeniable way, like the ordinary shape of his life. Clara had fallen into the household's rhythms with the practical ease of someone who'd always had to adapt and had gotten efficient at it. She took over the mending without being asked. She reorganized the kitchen's dry goods storage, which had developed the particular chaos of a place managed by someone who knew where everything was and therefore saw no reason to label anything. And she did it in a way that was both logical and didn't make him feel criticized for the previous system. She helped Emily with her lessons most afternoons, and the arithmetic that had been a source of low-grade conflict between Wyatt and his daughter for 6 months ceased to be a source of conflict almost immediately because Clara taught it differently, not as rules to memorize, but as problems to reason through. And Emily, who was constitutionally resistant to being told what to do but responded well to being asked to think, took to it. There were good moments in those 2 weeks, and there were also difficult ones. The town had not resolved. Wyatt's speech in the street had moved some people and hardened others, and the hardened ones were not quiet about it. Dale reported that 2 ranching families to the south had made a point of not greeting Wyatt at the supply house on a Tuesday. A small thing, but in a community of 30 miles between neighbors, a snub was significant. The reverend at the Garrison Church, a man named Collum, who had always been pleasant enough in Wyatt's limited dealings with him, delivered a Sunday sermon about the importance of moral clarity in community life that several people understood as a commentary on specific recent events, which meant half the congregation went home confirmed in their suspicions about Clara, and the other half went home irritated at Collum. Clara heard about the sermon from Nora and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Well, at least it was indirect," which was such a precisely Clara thing to say that Wyatt found himself somewhere between exasperated and something warmer than that. "It doesn't bother you?" he asked. It bothers me, she said. I just don't have much energy left to spend on things that are true everywhere I've ever been. She looked at the window. Anywhere a woman arrives alone, without money, without family, and needs something, there's always going to be a column, someone who dresses up other people's discomfort in the language of righteousness. She paused. The ones who matter are the ones who think it through and arrive somewhere different. He thought about Prudhoe. He thought about Fitch, the clerk, who had given them the copy of the filing without being asked twice. There are some of those, he said. There usually are, she said. Usually enough. Well, some. The reply from Aldrich Marsh came on a Thursday, 11 days after they'd sent the letter. It was 4 pages, dense and careful, and it said several things. First, that the registered instrument at the county clerk's office was legally sound and established Clara's claim to the Kellerman interest clearly, provided that her identity could be established to the court's satisfaction and that Edmund Hale's death had not been legally adjudicated in a way that altered the bequest. Second, that the bank's counterfiling was aggressive but legally thin. It relied on Vesper's estate being uncontested, which it would only be if no other interested party came forward to contest it, which Clara now clearly was. Third, and most importantly, Marsh had a contact in Pennsylvania, a former colleague who practiced in the county where Edmund Hale had died, and he had taken the liberty of writing to that contact before sending this letter. The reply from Pennsylvania, included as an enclosure, stated that Edmund Hale's death had been ruled natural causes, that no formal accusation of any kind had ever been filed against Clara Whitmore in that state, and that the rumors of her involvement in a killing had no legal basis whatsoever. Clara read the Pennsylvania enclosure twice. Then she set it down on the table and sat very still for a moment. No accusation, she said. There was never any accusation. He made it up entirely, Wyatt said. Or he paid someone to start the story, which amounts to the same thing. She pressed her hand flat against the table. 7 months, she said. I've been carrying this for 7 months. The looks, the whispers, the weight of it. 7 months of people treating me like a woman with something to hide. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. And it was nothing. It was just a lie he put into circulation because it cost him nothing and it cost me everything. Wyatt didn't say anything immediately. There wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate to what she'd just named, and he'd learned enough about her by now to know she didn't need him to fill the silence. She needed him to stay in it with her. After a moment, she took a breath. All right, she said. What do we do with this? We go back to Garrison, he said. We present this to the court. We file a formal contest of the bank's claim. And we make sure that Marsh's Pennsylvania contact is willing to put what he told us in writing that can be entered into a legal proceeding. That takes time. Yes, he said. But we have the standing now. Crow knew we'd have it eventually. That's why he needed you gone before you could establish it. He's not going to sit quietly while we build the case, she said. No, Wyatt agreed. He's going to do something. I don't know what. But we need to be in Garrison, in front of people with these documents, before he decides what his next move is. He looked at her. Are you ready for that? She picked up the Pennsylvania enclosure and read it one more time. Not the whole thing, just a line near the middle, the one that said plainly that no accusation had ever been filed. Yes, she said. They rode into Garrison on a Saturday, which was deliberate. Saturday was the day the most people were in town, the weekly rhythm of a rural community bringing families in from the surrounding ranches and farms for supplies, banking, and the accumulated social business of a week. Wyatt had sent word ahead to Prudhoe, who had said he'd be there and would bring a few people he thought should hear what was going to be said. He had not sent word to Crow. Marsh had agreed to be present in person. It was a shorter ride for him from the capital than Wyatt had expected, and the lawyer had written that he preferred to be present for the first formal presentation of the case because he found that documents landed differently when there was a person standing beside them who could answer questions. He was a compact, gray-haired man in a good coat and spectacles that he wore pushed down slightly on his nose, and he had the manner of someone who'd spent a career in rooms where people were trying to determine the truth of things and had developed a particular patience with the process. They met first at the courthouse, where Marsh presented the documents to the county judge, a man named Harkness, who Wyatt knew slightly and thought was honest, which in Garrison at this moment was the most important qualification. Harkness read everything with the slow thoroughness of a man who understood that how carefully you read something was a way of indicating how seriously you took it. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise. Marsh answered 2, and Clara answered 1. "The bank's counter-filing," Harkness said finally. "It goes into suspension pending the resolution of this contest. Nobody moves on the Kellerman tract until this is adjudicated." He looked at Marsh. "I'll want that Pennsylvania correspondence entered formally." "It will be," Marsh said. They were coming out of the courthouse when they encountered the crowd. It had gathered in the way that Saturday crowds in small towns do, not organized, not summoned, but formed from the natural aggregation of people who'd heard something was happening and had opinions about it. Crow was there, which Wyatt had expected. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the size of the group around him. Not just the men who were clearly his, but a larger number of townspeople who'd been living with the story for weeks, and had, in the way of people given one side of a situation, built their understanding around it. Crow looked at them coming down the courthouse steps, and something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The look of a man who'd planned for several scenarios and was now identifying which one was occurring. "Brennan," he said. "Crow," Wyatt said. "I heard you'd filed a contest." He said it without inflection, as if it were a matter of mild administrative interest. "We have," Marsh said, stepping forward slightly. "Aldrich Marsh, counsel for Miss Whitmore. The contest is filed, the judge has entered it, and the bank's claim is in suspension. If you'd like to discuss the specifics, I'm available Monday morning." Crow looked at Marsh with the expression of a man meeting an obstacle he hadn't fully accounted for. "I have counsel of my own," he said. "I assumed you would," Marsh said pleasantly. But Crow was already looking past Marsh, past Wyatt, toward the crowd that had gathered and was watching. Wyatt could see him calculating. He was always calculating. It was the thing about him that was most visible once you understood how he operated, working out what could be salvaged from a public moment that was no longer running the way he'd designed it. "Whatever is filed in that courthouse," Crow said, addressing the crowd as much as any of them, "doesn't change the fundamental question of character." He looked at Clara. "A document establishes a legal interest. It doesn't establish a person's fitness to—" "Silas," the voice came from somewhere in the crowd, and it stopped Crow mid-sentence. People turned. The crowd shifted, opening a path for the man who'd spoken, the way crowds do when they're not sure what's happening, but sense that it matters. He was old. That was the first thing Wyatt registered. Old in the way that speaks of physical difficulty, a man who moved carefully with a cane and whose age showed not just in his face, but in the particular deliberateness of how he held himself, as if each step was a negotiation. He was perhaps 75, with white hair and a face weathered to the texture of old leather, and he wore the clothes of a working man, not a banker, not a professional, but a carpenter or a builder, the kind of man whose hands told most of his story. Wyatt didn't know him, but from the way Crow's face changed, from calculation to something that might, in a younger or less practiced man, have been fear, it was clear that Crow did. "Harmon," Crow said, and then with a careful restraint that was its own kind of tell, "I didn't know you were in town." "I've been in town for 2 days," the old man said. His voice was quiet, but the crowd had gone quiet enough to carry it. "I've been trying to decide whether I was going to say anything." He looked at the crowd around him, then at Wyatt, then at Clara, and finally back at Crow. "I've been trying to decide for a long time. Months, really." He stopped and breathed. "I'm 76 years old, and I'm not well, and I find that when you're not well and you're old, the things you've been carrying get heavier, not lighter. I thought they'd get lighter." The crowd was very still. "My name is Walter Harmon," the old man said, clearly enough that everyone present could hear it. "I've been a carpenter in this county for 50 years. I've built things for most of the families here. I built the framing on this courthouse." He paused. "I also built the cabin on the Kellerman tract, the one that Edmund Hale used when he came out here 2 years ago to arrange his business with Harlan Vesper." Wyatt felt Clara go still beside him. "I was there," Walter Harmon said, "when Silas Crow came to see Hale. I was working in the back room, and I don't think they knew I was there, or I think they'd have sent me away." He was looking at Crow now, steadily, with the look of a man who's made a decision he can't take back and is not going to look away from it. "I heard what was said," Crow told Hale the arrangement with Vesper was going to cause problems. He told him there were ways to handle it quietly. Hale said he wasn't interested in handling it quietly, that he'd made a promise to a woman back east, and he intended to keep it. The silence was complete, and then Crow said something that I've been hearing in my sleep for 8 months, Harmon said. He said, "There are ways to make sure certain promises become irrelevant." And 2 months later, Hale was dead. He paused. And then Vesper was dead. And they were both convenient deaths, and I knew what I'd heard, and I was afraid. His voice did not break, but it changed quality, the tiredness in it becoming more visible. I'm an old man, and I was afraid, and I told myself it wasn't enough. What I'd heard, it wasn't evidence of anything specific. I told myself a lot of things. He looked at the crowd. But this woman has been standing in this town being called a murderer since before she arrived. And she didn't kill anyone, and the man who arranged for people to believe she did is standing right there, and I'm tired of being afraid of him. He stopped speaking. The silence lasted several seconds, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of people absorbing something and running it against everything they already believed, finding the places where it fit and the places where it required revision. Crow's face had changed, not broken. He was too practiced for that, too accustomed to controlling what his face communicated. But the calculation had stopped, which was a different thing. He looked at Harmon with an expression that was nothing but the absence of the performance he usually wore, and what was underneath was much less impressive. "That's a serious claim," Marsh said quietly, stepping slightly forward. He had a small journal in his hand and a pencil, and he was already writing. "Mr. Harmon, I'll need to speak with you formally, as soon as possible. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement?" "That's why I'm here," Harmon said. Crow moved. Not toward Harmon. He was too careful for direct confrontation. But he turned and said something to one of the men behind him, low and sharp, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders that were immediately followed. The man started toward the edge of the crowd. "Whatever you're thinking of doing," Wyatt said, addressing both Crow and the man, "you should know that there are enough witnesses on this street to account for everything that's about to happen." He said it evenly, without heat. "And that includes what you just said to him." Several people in the crowd had turned to watch the man Crow had sent. He stopped, looked back at Crow. Crow's jaw was set. Prudhoe, the old alderman, moved through the crowd to stand near Harmon. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was its own statement. A woman Wyatt didn't know moved to the other side of Harmon. Then a man he did know, the hardware merchant, a steady, deliberate Norwegian named Lund, who'd been in garrison almost as long as Wyatt had been on the ranch, walked across the street and stood with them. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't dramatic. It was just people deciding, one at a time, in the public middle of a Saturday morning, which side of something they were on. Crow looked at all of it. "This isn't over," he said, and it was directed at Wyatt. "I know," Wyatt said. "That's why we have a lawyer." Crow turned and went back into the bank, and the door closed, and what happened after that door closed would take months to work through the proper channels. The sworn statements, the formal hearings, the depositions from Pennsylvania, the forensic accounting that Marsh eventually requested, and that would reveal the full extent of Crow's manipulation of both Vesper's estate and the fabricated story about Clara. The criminal charges would be slower still. These things always are. But the moment the door closed, something shifted in the street. Not the whole thing, not immediately. There were people who left without saying anything, who would need more time or more evidence or simply the long, slow passage of public opinion. But the central gravity of it had changed. Clara found Walter Harmon before Marsh did. She crossed the street to where he'd stopped, with one hand resting on a post for support, his breathing a little labored from the effort of what he'd just done. She stood in front of him, and for a moment she didn't say anything. "Thank you," she said finally. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and had set it down and wasn't sure yet how he felt about the lightness. "I should have said it months ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you said it now. You're not angry." "I'm angry at Crow," she said. "I'm not going to use up anger on a frightened old man who finally told the truth." She looked at him steadily. "I know what it costs to say something when you're afraid. I know it better than most people." He looked at her for a moment. "He tried to have you killed," he said, in that blizzard. I know. I didn't know about that until yesterday. Clem told me, the young man from the ranch. I ran into him at the supply house. He shook his head slowly. If I'd known he'd gone that far. You know now, she said, and you're here. She looked back at Wyatt, who was talking with Marsh and Prudhoe, the three of them standing close together over the documents with the focused air of men building something. She looked back at Harmon. Can you walk? Marsh is going to want to sit down somewhere warm and write all of this down properly. I can walk, he said. Slowly. Slowly is fine, she said. I'll match your pace. And she did. Bad. They didn't leave Garrison until late afternoon, and the ride home was in the cold blue dusk that came down fast in February, the sky darkening from the east while the west still held a faint line of color above the mountains. Wyatt drove. Clara sat beside him, closer than she usually sat, which he didn't think was about the cold entirely. They'd spent 2 hours in the back room of the hotel with Marsh and Harmon and Prudhoe and Lund and a woman named Garrity, who turned out to have known Harlan Vesper and had her own things to add about the timeline of his decline and the bank's unusual interest in his affairs before his death. Marsh had filled the better part of a notebook. He'd sent a telegram to his Pennsylvania contact before they left. He'd told Wyatt privately, outside the hotel, that he believed this would result in a formal criminal inquiry within the next month, and that the civil claim on the Kellerman tract was effectively decided. Claire's interest was too well documented and too well witnessed to be overcome by the bank's filing now that Harmon had provided the context for it. How much does he owe you? Wyatt had asked. We'll discuss the fee later, Marsh had said, in the way of lawyers who understand that the answer is complicated and the moment is not the right time. On the road home, the horses moved steadily through the cold and the last light faded and the stars came out sharp and close the way they did on clear winter nights at altitude. Are you all right? Wyatt asked. Clara considered the question with the honesty she brought to most things. I'm tired, she said. The kind of tired that's underneath the regular kind. The kind that's been there a long time. From carrying this. From carrying this, and from before this, and from the years before that. She looked up at the stars. I keep waiting to feel something definitive. Relief, or victory, or something that has a clear shape. But it just feels like the weight shifting. It takes time, he said. I know. She paused. I believe it, I think. I'm not sure I feel it yet. That's honest. I try to be. She was quiet for a moment. Emily's going to ask what happened. She is. How much do we tell her? What she can hold, he said. She can hold more than most adults think. But I don't need her to hold the criminal part yet. Clara nodded. We tell her the truth got told, she said. That's the important part for a child. That the truth got told and it mattered. It did matter, he said. Today it mattered. She looked at him. You're not angry? At Crow? He thought about it. He'd expected to feel something corrosive when the moment came. When Crow's plans started coming apart in public. When Harmon stood up and said what he'd heard. He'd expected something that needed burning off. What he felt instead was something more settled, heavier, but without the heat. I'm angry, he said, but I don't want to do anything with it other than make sure the law does what it's supposed to. He looked at the road. Crow's going to lose more than the land. He's going to lose the position, the influence, the 20 years of maneuvering he's built in this county. Watching the law take that apart slowly and completely is enough for me. He paused. More satisfying, actually, than anything I could do with anger. Clara was quiet for a moment. Edmund would have liked you, she said. It was the first time she'd said anything like that, connected the two parts of her life so directly. He was a gentle man, not a strong one, in some ways, but he tried to do the right thing even when it cost him. She looked at her hands. I think that's why Crow moved against him. Men like Crow can't tolerate people who won't be leveraged. Edmund wouldn't sell and he wouldn't be bought, and it killed him. She paused. He tried to protect me with that filing, even when he was afraid. He set it up so that if something happened to him, I'd have something. He did, Wyatt said. He was better to me than most people had been, she said. I owe him the truth getting out. She looked ahead at the road, at the darkness of the valley, and the ranch lights still not visible yet. Today was part of that, Harmon telling the truth. That's part of giving Edmund what he's owed. The wagon moved on through the dark. Clara, Wyatt said. Yes. What you said in the street today? When you told the crowd there was never a formal accusation, that anyone with evidence should present it. He paused. That was the kind of thing that either works entirely or fails entirely. I know, she said. I calculated the odds. And I decided that saying it directly and being wrong was better than not saying it and living in the middle. She glanced at him. I've been in the middle my whole life. Waiting, being careful, not wanting to commit to a position in case it turned out to be wrong. It's exhausting. It is, he said. You've done the same thing, she said. It wasn't an accusation. The 4 years since your wife. Yes, he said. It's easier, in some ways. The middle. For a while, he said. They came over the ridge and the ranch lights appeared in the valley below. The main house, the stable, the foreman's cottage, the outbuildings strung together by the logic of 23 years of a working place. The yellow square of a lit window, Emily's lamp, as always, burning. I keep thinking about that sign, Clara said. The one he'd mentioned, the first night, the one your wife carved. What about it? I'd like to learn the ranch's name, she said. All of it, the way you know it. He was quiet for a moment. I'll show you, he said. When the thaw comes. All of it. She nodded once, settled, as if that completed something she'd been waiting to have completed. They rode the last mile in a comfortable quiet. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the quieter and more valuable kind. The silence of people who've said enough for one day and are content to let the dark and the cold and the stars carry the rest of it. The thaw came in the second week of March, and it came the way Montana thaws always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in fits and arguments. A warm day followed by a cold snap, followed by 3 days of rain that turned everything to mud and made the access road nearly impassable, and drove Dale to the kind of sustained low-level profanity that he usually reserved for equipment failures. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the dead grass underneath, pale and matted, and then the north slopes began to loosen, and the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the property went from frozen silence to a sound like something waking up angry. It was not a pretty season. Wyatt had never romanticized mud season, and he wasn't going to start. The cattle needed more attention during the transition, the ground was treacherous in the low spots, and everything smelled like wet earth and livestock, and the particular organic insistence of a land asserting that winter was finished with it, whether anyone was ready or not. But the light changed. That was the thing that mattered. The days stretched, almost imperceptibly at first, and then noticeably, the evening lasting longer each day until suddenly, one afternoon, Wyatt came in from the upper pasture and it was past 6, and the sky was still pale above the mountains, and he stood at the gate and held that for a moment before going inside. The legal process, as Marsh had warned, moved at its own pace and not anyone else's. The criminal inquiry into Silas Crow had been formally opened by the territorial court in late February, initiated by the judge in Garrison and supported by the sworn statements of Walter Harmon, the testimony Marsh had gathered from 3 other witnesses who'd come forward in the weeks following that Saturday, and the forensic review of the bank's records that revealed what Marsh called, with lawyerly understatement, a pattern of irregularities that would take considerable time to fully document. Crow had hired counsel from the Capitol, expensive counsel, and the case was not going to resolve quickly. These things never did. But certain things moved faster than the criminal process. The bank's claim on the Kellerman tract was formally dismissed in the first week of March. Judge Harkness had reviewed the full body of evidence and found the bank's counterfiling to be built on a chain of assumptions that no longer held once Harmon's testimony, and the Pennsylvania correspondence were entered into the record. Clara's interest in the tract was confirmed. The property was hers. Marsh wrote to inform them of this on a Tuesday, and Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on because she'd taken it from Clem at the gate and hadn't waited to get inside. Wyatt watched her read it and watched her face and saw the moment she reached the confirming paragraph. Not a dramatic moment, not tears or any performance of relief, just a very small stillness, the kind that comes when something you've been braced against for a long time is suddenly no longer there. She looked up, It's done, she said. The civil part, he said. Crow's still, I know, she said. But this part. She looked at the letter again. This is what Edmund wanted. He set it up so that if something happened to him, I'd have something that was mine, that couldn't be taken. She folded the letter carefully. He managed it, even from the end. Wyatt said nothing. He understood by now that Edmund Hale was not a figure of jealousy or complication in the landscape of what he and Clara were building. He was someone she'd lost, someone who'd tried to do right by her and paid for it, and the grief she carried for him was the kind that coexists with other things rather than displacing them. What will you do with it? He asked. The land. She looked at him steadily. I haven't decided, she said. I'd like to see it first. She paused. You said you'd show me the ranch, all of it. The ground's soft, he said. I can ride in soft ground. He almost smiled. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she said, and took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door in the place that had become, over the past 2 months, without either of them marking the specific day it happened, her hook. Crow resigned from the town council in early March, which was technically voluntary but wasn't, in the way that things are technically voluntary when the alternative has become untenable. The bank underwent a review by the Territorial Banking Commission. 2 of Crow's associates, the men who'd been present at various stages of his maneuvering, had already given statements to the inquiry that, Marsh reported, were proving useful. Men who've built their position on a powerful patron tend to reassess their loyalties with some speed when the patron's power begins to visibly dissolve. The 2 witnesses Crow had prepared to testify against Clara, the ones who'd been ready to swear to a version of Edmund's death that placed Clara at the center of it, recanted within a week of Harmon's statement. Marsh told Wyatt this without drama, as a matter of process. What had happened was that the foundation Crow had built his story on was revealed to be built on paid testimony, and paid testimony has a specific structural weakness. Once the money stops being reliable, the testimony often stops being reliable too. There would still be a trial, probably 2, the criminal inquiry into Edmund's death and Vespers, and a separate proceeding regarding the fraudulent claim. These would take months, possibly more than a year. Wyatt did not follow every development with the attention Clara did. She read Marsh's letters twice and sometimes asked Wyatt to read them and give her his reaction, which he'd come to understand was not because she needed his interpretation, but because talking it through with someone helped her order her own thoughts. He was useful to her in that way. It was a specific and practical kind of being needed, and he found he didn't mind it. What he found he didn't mind, increasingly, were a great many things he hadn't expected to be fine with. He didn't mind that Emily had begun calling her Clara without the miss, which had happened gradually and then all at once in the way children shift their relationships when they've quietly decided something. He didn't mind the sound of 2 people talking in the kitchen when he came in from the morning rounds, the murmur of Clara and Emily discussing whatever they were discussing, which was sometimes lessons and sometimes the ranch and sometimes, he'd gathered from fragments, the general nature of people and why they did the things they did, which was a topic Emily apparently found inexhaustible, and Clara apparently found worth engaging with seriously. He didn't mind waking up in the morning and knowing she was in the house. That one had taken him longer to look at directly, but he'd looked at it. Saturday was clear and cold and smelled like mud and pine and the creek running fast. He saddled 2 horses, Buck for himself and a steady bay mare named Nell for Clara, who rode with the competence of someone who'd learned young and hadn't forgotten, though she'd told him she'd had no access to horses for the better part of a decade in Pennsylvania. Emily stood on the porch with her arms crossed in the way that communicated she felt she'd been left out of something important. You could come, Clara said, pulling on her gloves. Papa said the ground was too soft, Emily said, with the tone of someone quoting a ruling they disagreed with. The lower ground is, Wyatt said. We're going up. I could ride up. Next time, he said, when the mud settled. Emily looked at Clara with the expression of someone seeking an appeal. He's right about the mud, Clara said. But next time I'll make sure you come. I'll need you to tell me the names of things. Your father is not reliable on the names of things. I name things fine, Wyatt said. You called that peak to the north one, Clara said. Emily almost smiled. It's called Heron's Bluff, she told Clara, after a man named Heron who fell off it 70 years ago. That's more information than your father provided. He's not interested in names, Emily said. He's interested in whether things work. Wyatt got on his horse. Are we going or not? They went. He took her up through the south pasture first, where the cattle were beginning to push toward the higher grass that was showing through in patches between the snow. They stopped at the rise where you could see the full width of the valley. The ranch laid out below, the buildings small from this height, and the land spreading in every direction with the mountains on three sides, and the pale V of the river visible to the south. Clara sat on Nell and looked at it for a long time. You can see where it ends, she said. The property. The fence line to the east, he said. That ridge is the northern boundary. South runs down to the river. You know every acre of it. Most of them. She looked at it a while longer. When you came out here, she said. 23 years ago. Was it this much land then? About a third of this, he said. The south section I bought in the second year. The north ridge took 10 years, piece by piece. You built it slowly. You can't build something like this fast, he said. Fast means you're borrowing against what you haven't earned yet. I didn't want to spend 20 years paying for a decision I made in 2. She turned to look at him. That's how you think about most things, isn't it? He considered that. Probably, he said. It's a good way, she said. It's slower than I'd like sometimes, but it holds better. They rode on. He showed her the creek and the place where the upper spring fed it, which ran year-round and was the reason he'd chosen this section of the valley over 2 others he'd looked at in that first year. Reliable water was worth more than anything else in Montana, and he'd known it before he bought the first acre. He showed her the north fence where Dale's crew had done the repair work in February, the new posts still a lighter color than the old ones. He showed her the timber stand in the upper corner of the property that he'd never logged and didn't intend to, because timber stands had their own function in the watershed, and because he liked the way it looked when the snow was on it. He was not a man who talked much about what he liked. She'd figured that out early and didn't push for it. But she was quiet in a way that made it easier to say things, and he found himself saying more than he usually would have. They came around the long way back, down through the eastern slope and along the creek, and the horses picked their way through the soft ground with the careful attention of horses that know the terrain. The afternoon light was long and yellow, and the mountains were doing the thing where they looked like they were painted onto the sky, rather than part of it. They stopped at the gate to the main yard, and that was when she saw it fully for the first time in daylight, from the right angle. The sign. He'd mentioned it that first night. She'd said she'd seen it for a second before the snow covered everything. But she'd been in the house and in the yard since then without having had occasion to stand at the main gate in good light and look at it directly. It was not large, a piece of hardwood about 2 feet across, hung on iron hooks from the top rail of the gate, carved with a skill that was evident in the precision of the letters and the cleanness of the borders. Rose had made it 8 years ago, in the winter of the second year of their marriage, using tools she'd bought herself with money she'd saved from teaching. He'd watched her work on it for 3 weeks, in the evenings after Emily was asleep, until it was what she wanted it to be, Brennan Ranch. Below it, smaller, Easteen, 1871. And below that, carved with more care than either of the others, a line that Rose had put there without telling him it was coming. Built by hands that intend to stay. Clara sat on Nell and read it, and he watched her read it, and she was quiet for a moment that was longer than usual. She put that last line there herself? Clara asked. Without telling me it was coming, he said. I came out one morning, and there it was. What did you say? He thought back. I said, who told you that was the plan? He paused. She said, no one had to. It was obvious from the way you planted the fence posts. He looked at the sign. She meant it as a compliment. Rose had a way of complimenting people that was disguised as an observation. Clara looked at the sign for another moment. She was right, she said, about the fence posts. He looked at her. About the intending to stay, she said. Everything here has that quality. Nothing is built for the short term. Even the repairs Dale's crew did on the north fence. Those posts are in deeper than they needed to be for a patch job. She looked at him. You don't know how to do things halfway. I don't think it's in you. He didn't say anything for a moment. Clara, he said. Yes. I'd like to get married, he said. if that's still what you want. She looked at him. The afternoon light was full on her face, and she looked tired in the way she often did. The underneath tired, the kind that was always there. But her eyes were clear and direct and not guarded in the way they'd been in the early days. "We were going to get married anyway," she said. "I know. I'm asking again, without the arrangement being the reason." He looked at her steadily. "Because I want to. Because this is you, in this place, is right. That's the reason." She held his gaze for several seconds. Then she said, "You chose a very cold afternoon for this conversation." "I thought the setting was appropriate," he said. "The setting," she said, "is a muddy gate and two horses who want to go back to the stable. The mountains are very... If you say the mountains are beautiful, I'm going to question your judgment about everything." "I wasn't going to say that," he said. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say the mountains are adequate," he said, "given the circumstances." She made the sound that was her laugh, the one that came out when she wasn't guarding against it. And it was the best sound he'd heard in a long time, maybe in years, the kind of laugh that doesn't perform anything and is therefore worth a great deal. "Yes," she said, "I want to marry you. I wanted to marry you 2 weeks after I got here and have been waiting for you to catch up." "I wasn't aware there was a race," he said. "There wasn't," she said. "I was just ready before you." She turned Nell toward the stable. "Are you ready now?" "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, and rode in. Yeah. They married in April on a Saturday in the main room of the ranch house. It was not a large ceremony. Marsh had come up from the capital, which was not a short ride, and had stood in the back with the expression of a man who found civil ceremonies a reasonable use of a Saturday. Prudo was there, and Lund the hardware merchant, and Nora and Dale, and Walter Harmon, who'd been well enough to make the trip from town and sat in the best chair near the fire and said nothing much but looked on with the expression of a man who needed to see something come out right. There was no minister. There was a justice of the peace, a small practical woman named Garber, who drove a wagon herself and had the manner of someone who'd performed enough of these to know that the ceremony was the least important part. Emily stood beside Clara during the brief formal portion of it, which had not been planned. She'd simply moved there when things were beginning, and no one had suggested she move back. Clara had looked down at her, and Emily had looked up, and some communication had passed between them that Wyatt had not been part of and didn't need to be. Afterward, Nora produced food that she'd spent 2 days on and didn't want discussed or complimented on, just eaten, and they ate it. Dale and Prudo talked about the spring cattle prices. Marsh told Wyatt quietly that the criminal inquiry against Crow had expanded to include a third count, which the territorial prosecutor was treating as the most serious charge, and that the trial would likely begin in June. Lund told a story about something that had happened at the hardware store that was not particularly interesting but took 20 minutes to tell, and was delivered with such earnest commitment that everyone listened anyway. Walter Harmon, near the end of the afternoon, found a moment alone with Clara and said something to her that Wyatt didn't hear. He saw Clara's face when the old man said it, and he saw her put her hand briefly on his arm, and that was enough. Emily fell asleep in her chair before the guests had all left, which was the most 9-year-old thing she'd done in months, and Wyatt carried her to her room and stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he sometimes did, this habit he had of just looking at her when she was asleep, as if the looking was a way of taking stock of something important. When he came back out, Clara was in the kitchen, doing what she always did after people left, quietly putting things back to rights, moving through the space with that same economy he'd noticed the first days and had long since stopped noticing because it had become simply the way she was. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, not stopping. He sat at the table and watched her for a moment. "She looked right, standing beside you," he said. "Emily, during the ceremony." Clara stopped and looked at him. "She moved there herself," she said. "I didn't ask her." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at the dish in her hands, then set it down carefully. She sat across from him. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after people have been in it and left, the warmth still there, the leftover sense of company. "I've been thinking about the Kellerman tract," she said. "I figured you'd get to it." "Timberland," she said, 300 acres. The rail expansion is going to make that significantly more valuable in the next 5 years. She looked at the table. I could sell it. I could invest it. It could be a lot of things. What do you want it to be? She was quiet for a moment. I want to do something with it that makes sense in the long term, she said. Not fast, not for the short money. She looked at him. I was thinking that if the timber is managed carefully, selective cutting, planned replanting, it could be sustainable income for decades. Not a fortune, but steady. He thought about that. Dale knows a man who does sustainable timber management up in the Northern Territory, he said. They've been running a sustainable operation for 12 years. Could you write to him? Monday, he said. She nodded. Then she said, I want to put part of it into the ranch. Whatever we draw from the timber in the first years. I know the ranch is financially stable. Marsh looked at your books and said so. But stable means you've been doing it without a margin for bad years. Last year's cattle prices were lower than they should have been, he said. I know. A bad drought year on top of that would hurt, she said. Not fatally, but it would hurt. He looked at her. She had read Marsh's assessment of the ranch finances without him asking her to. She had identified the same weak point he'd been quietly aware of for 2 years. She had a plan for it. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since February, she said. I didn't want to say anything until the legal piece was settled. It seemed premature to plan around something I didn't fully own yet. He was quiet for a moment. That's practical, he said. I try to be, she said, when I'm not being the other thing. What's the other thing? She looked at him. Afraid, she said. Hopeful. Both at the same time, which is exhausting. She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way she said the things that cost her something. I've been afraid to plan too far ahead most of my life because every time I did, something took the plan away. So I've been practicing. She looked at the table. Letting myself plan. Letting myself think in years instead of weeks. He thought about Rose, who had carved built by hands that intend to stay without warning him. It was coming. He thought about what it meant to intend something in a place like this, where the winters were hard and the work was constant and nothing was guaranteed and you built it anyway, because the alternative was to live somewhere inside yourself and never really arrive. I've been practicing the same thing, he said. Since January. She looked at him. Since the blizzard? Since the blizzard, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April night had come down fully, and the creek was audible even from inside. That new season sound of water moving fast and cold, and with somewhere to go. I didn't think Montana would feel like this, she said. Like what? She took a moment to find it. Like somewhere I could put weight on, she said, like ground that holds. She looked at the window. Pennsylvania it was where I was from, but it never felt like I was supposed to stay. Like every year was temporary, waiting for whatever came next. She paused. I don't feel that here. Good, he said. Did you feel that when you came? He thought about the young man he'd been, 23, coming west with his father's money and his mother's stubbornness, looking at this valley for the first time and feeling something click into place that hadn't been in place before. The first winter almost broke me, he said. The isolation, the work, the cold. I wasn't prepared for how hard it was. He looked at his hands, but in the spring, when the thaw came and the land came back, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't a decision anymore. It was just true. She nodded slowly. That's what it feels like now, she said. Not a decision anymore. The sign went up in late April. Wyatt had been planning it for weeks, quietly, without telling Clara or Emily, working on it in the stable in the hour after the day's work was done when the light lasted long enough. He wasn't Rose. He didn't have her precision, and he didn't have her patience with tools. But he had the drafts she'd left in the back of her workbox, the ones she'd done before settling on the final design, and he followed them as carefully as he could. It was slightly uneven on the left edge. The letters were less graceful than hers. But the wood was good, and the carving was deep enough to last, and the words he'd chosen were his own. He hung it on the same gate, below her original sign. A second piece, smaller, hung from 2 small hooks underneath. Room made. All welcome who stay. He hadn't told them what he was doing. He let them find it. Emily found it first on a Tuesday morning and stood at the gate for a long time and then came back inside and went to her lessons without saying anything, which was how she processed things that mattered. Clara found it in the afternoon when she rode out toward the creek and came back through the main gate, and she stopped Nell and sat there reading it. He was at the fence nearby pretending to check something, and he didn't look at her directly. But he heard her pull up and stop, and he heard the quality of the silence that followed. After a while, she rode up beside him. "It's a little uneven on the left," she said. "I know." "You used her drafts." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me," she said. "I would have helped." "It needed to be mine," he said. "Specifically." She looked at him. "Room maid," she said. "All welcome who stay." "Yes." "Not very poetic," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't need to be," she said. "It just needs to be true." "It is," he said. She looked at the sign one more time. The two pieces of it, Rose's original above and his edition below, different hands and different years and the same gate. Then she looked at the valley and the mountains and the creek and the wide late April sky. And she looked like someone who'd finally stopped waiting for the thing she was looking at to disappear. The trial of Silas Crow began in June and lasted 11 days. Wyatt attended when he could, which was not every day. The ranch didn't pause for court proceedings. But Clara attended most sessions, with Marsh beside her, and she came home each evening and told him what had happened with the same clear, factual economy she brought to everything. Harmon's testimony took a full day and was apparently the moment the jury's attention changed. An old man who'd been afraid for 8 months, telling the truth at last, had a weight that legal documents alone didn't carry. Crow was convicted on 2 counts. The third, the one relating to Edmund's death, required a standard of evidence that couldn't quite be met without a full forensic investigation that the court ruled was outside the current proceeding. That case was referred forward, unresolved, which was not a full satisfaction. Clara sat with that for several days. She didn't pretend it was enough, but she also didn't pretend it was nothing. "He's going to prison," she said one evening, not long after the verdict, "for the fraud, for the claim, for what he did to Vesper's estate. That's real." She looked at the fire. "Edmund may not get justice in a courtroom, but the man who killed him isn't going to spend another winter in that bank." She paused. "I'll take that. It's not everything, but it's not nothing." "It's not nothing," Wyatt agreed. "I've been thinking about what nothing looks like," she said. "Nothing was what I came from. No claim, no standing, no one willing to say what they'd seen. No Harmon, no Marsh, no—" She stopped. "No you." She looked at him. "Nothing was where I was headed in that blizzard. This is a long way from nothing." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while. What stays with you about a life, in the end, is not the dramatic moments. They matter. The blizzard, the street in Garrison, Harmon's voice cutting through the crowd. But they don't constitute the life. The life is the accumulation of everything around them. The mornings, the ordinary work, the way someone moves through a kitchen, the sound of a child's voice from the next room doing arithmetic out loud, the specific quality of an April evening when the light lasts until past 8, and the mountains are doing something complicated with the cloud cover, and the cattle are settled and the dogs are quiet, and you're sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that's gone slightly cold because you've been sitting there too long and you don't particularly care. Emily grew. She grew the way children grow when they're growing well. Not just taller, but wider in some interior sense. More willing to take up space, more willing to say what she thought without checking first to see if it was wanted. She fought with Clara occasionally, real fights, the kind that involve door closing and pointed silences, and the eventual uncomfortable reconciliation that comes when two people who are both stubborn and both in the right about part of it decide they'd rather sort it out than continue being right in their separate corners. These fights disturbed Wyatt more than they disturbed either of the people involved, which Clara found funny and Emily found evidence that fathers were a different kind of creature entirely. She started calling Clara Mama in the fall, after school had started again, and she'd had occasion to introduce her to another family in Garrison, and had used the word without thinking, and then looked surprised at herself. Clara had not made a big thing of it, which was exactly right. She'd just continued the conversation, and Emily had continued it with her, And afterward, Emily had come to Wyatt and asked privately whether that was all right. "Did it feel right when you said it?" he asked. Emily thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Then it's all right," he said. She accepted this and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and he stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, which he needed. Clara, when he told her later, sat quietly with it for a moment and then said, "I'm not replacing her mother. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to." "I know," he said. "Emily knows too," she said. "She's not confused about that. She's very clear about the distinction." "She is," he agreed. "I think she's decided that it's possible to have both things," Clara said. "The memory and the present. She doesn't think she has to choose." She looked at the window. "She's smarter than either of us about most things." "She is," he said. The timber operation on the Kellerman tract began in a small and careful way in the following spring, managed by the man Dale had known, who turned out to be as methodical and long-term in his thinking as Wyatt had hoped. The first cutting was selective, the replanting started immediately, and the income was modest but real, enough to provide exactly what Clara had identified, the margin against a bad year that the ranch had been operating without. The bad year, when it came, was the drought of the following summer. It was not catastrophic. They lost fewer cattle than 3 ranches to the south and managed the water carefully enough to keep the best of the herd through it. But without the timber income, it would have been a harder winter. Clara said nothing about this directly. She didn't need to. They both knew. She was a practical person. She had always been a practical person, and the life she'd built on the ranch was a practical one. She knew the cattle, she knew the finances, she knew the seasonal demands and the weak points and the decisions that needed to be made in which order. But she was also, Wyatt had come to understand, a person who needed space to think things that weren't practical, and she'd found that space in unexpected places. In the timber stand in the upper corner of the property that he'd never logged, which she went to sometimes by herself and came back from without explanation. In the letters she wrote to Marsh even after the legal business was concluded, which he gathered were not entirely about legal matters. In the long rides she took in the evenings when the work was done and the light lasted and the valley showed itself at its most honest. He never asked what she thought about in those hours. He didn't need to. She came back from them more settled, and that was what mattered. What he knew, from watching, and from what she'd told him in the accumulated thousands of hours of ordinary conversation that constituted a marriage, was this. She had spent her whole life arriving in places where she was tolerated at best and unwanted at worst, where she was managed or accommodated or ignored, where her presence was a complication others worked around rather than something that mattered. She had built her interior life on the working assumption that she was probably alone in any room she entered, regardless of who else was there. And what the ranch had given her, slowly, imperfectly, with the ordinary friction of real people in real proximity, was evidence against that assumption. It didn't resolve all at once. These things don't. There were mornings she was still too far inside herself to be reached, and evenings where something, a word, a look, a small misunderstanding, would touch the old wound and she'd close up in the careful way she had. And he'd learned not to push, just to be there, which was harder than it sounded and more useful than anything else he could do. But she came back. She always came back. That was the thing he relied on. One evening, in the second autumn of their marriage, they were sitting on the porch in the last of the light, the kind of evening that September produced as a kind of apology for August's heat. And Clara was reading a letter from Marsh about the status of the Edmund Hale case, still unresolved, still referred forward, likely to remain so. And she finished reading it and folded it and set it on her knee and looked at the mountains for a long time. "I've been thinking about the sign," she said. He looked at her. "Which part?" "The part I added," she said. He'd come home one afternoon in July to find a third piece hung below the other 2. He'd had no idea she'd been working on it. She'd used Rose's tools, which she'd found in the workbox, and had asked him, months ago, if she could use. He'd said of course. Her carving was better than his. More patient. It said, earned, not given. Held with both hands. He'd stood at the gate and read it for a long time. "What about it?" he asked. "I want Emily to understand it," she said. "When she's older. What it means." She looked at the letter on her knee. The things worth having are not the things that arrive easily. Edmund understood that, I think, at the end. He was a man who hadn't had to work hard for most things, and he died trying to do something hard on behalf of someone else, which was the bravest thing about him. She paused. I don't want Emily to grow up thinking this, she gestured, a small motion that took in the porch and the house and the valley and all of it, is something that was just given to us, or just given to her. She doesn't think that, he said. I know, but I want the sign to say it anyway. She looked at the mountains, because I needed to hear it myself for a long time before I believed it, and I'm still not always sure I do. He looked at her. This woman with the rope marks long faded, and the underneath tired still present, and the dry humor, and the steady hands, and the particular way she had of saying true things as plainly as possible, because she'd learned that ornamentation usually hid something. You earned it, he said. All of it. She looked at him. So did you, she said. The difference is that you've always known that, and I'm still catching up. He didn't argue with her. She was right, and they both knew it, and the catching up was something she had to do in her own time. The last light left the mountains, and the stars began. And from inside the house came the sound of Emily doing something in the kitchen that involved more noise than it probably needed to, which was a personality trait that had been present from birth and showed no signs of modifying. She's going to burn something, Clara said. Probably. Should we? She'll come get us if she needs help, he said. She always does. Clara settled back in her chair. Yes, she said. She does. They sat in the dark and listened to the creek and the cattle settling for the night, and the ordinary ongoing sounds of a place that was inhabited and worked and cared for, and the 3 signs hung on the gate at the bottom of the lane, 3 different hands and 3 different years, saying the same thing in different words. This is the place. These are the people. This is what it means to stay. Some things you don't find. You build them, slowly, imperfectly, out of whatever you have and whatever arrives, and whatever you're willing to hold on to when it gets hard. You build them with your hands and your stubbornness and your willingness to be afraid and stay anyway. And if you're careful, and if you're honest, and if you're lucky in the particular way that has less to do with fortune than with recognizing the right thing when it's standing in front of you, sometimes what you build is enough to hold the weight of a life. Sometimes it's more than enough. Sometimes it becomes home.